The morning air was crisp and, sharp as December, settled over London like a familiar blanket. Westminster Abbey stood tall and majestic against the gray sky, its ancient stones holding centuries of stories, prayers, and royal ceremonies. Today would mark another significant moment in its long history as King Charles III prepared to lead the traditional Advent service that would officially begin the Christmas season for millions across the Commonwealth. Inside the palace, the king stood before a tall mirror in his private chambers, adjusting the ceremonial robes that felt both familiar and weighted with responsibility. At 75, Charles had waited longer than any heir in British history to wear the crown, and now, 18 months into his reign, every public appearance carried the gravity of representing not just a nation, but a 1,000-year-old institution that had weathered wars, scandals, and social upheaval. His reflection showed a man who had aged considerably since becoming king. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his hair had grown whiter, but there was something else in his expression, a sense of purpose that had crystallized since his mother's passing. Queen Elizabeth II had been the anchor of stability for 70 years, and now that anchor had passed to him. "Your Majesty, the car is ready," announced his private secretary from the doorway. Charles nodded, taking one last look at the speech notes he had personally revised 3 times the night before. This wasn't just any service. It was his first Advent service as sovereign, and he wanted every word to resonate with the hope and reflection that the season demanded. The journey to Westminster Abbey was short, but significant. As the royal car moved through the streets of London, Charles watched ordinary people going about their daily lives. Mothers pushing prams, office workers hurrying with coffee cups, elderly couples walking arm in arm. These were his people now, and their hopes and struggles weighed on him more heavily than any crown ever could. At Westminster Abbey, preparations had been underway since dawn. The flower arrangements were a careful balance of traditional winter greenery and modern touches, holly and ivy intertwined with white roses and silver accents. The massive space, which could hold over 2,000 people, buzzed with quiet activity as ushers checked seating arrangements and choir members ran through their final rehearsals. Dean of Westminster, Dr. David Hoyle, moved through the Abbey with practiced efficiency, but even he felt the particular weight of this day. He had overseen the king's coronation just months before, but this service felt more intimate, more personal. Advent was about waiting, about hope in darkness, about the promise of light to come. Themes that resonated deeply in a world still recovering from pandemic isolation and economic uncertainty. The guest list for the service read like a who's who of British society. Government ministers sat alongside charity workers, military veterans shared pews with young volunteers, and representatives from every major faith community had been invited. This was Charles's vision of modern monarchy, inclusive, representative, and deeply connected to the real lives of ordinary people. Among the guests was Margaret Thompson, an 83-year-old woman from Birmingham who had received an invitation after 50 years of volunteer work with homeless shelters. She had never imagined she would sit in Westminster Abbey, much less for a service led by the king himself. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her program, not from nervousness, but from overwhelming gratitude. Nearby sat Dr. Amara Okafor, a young physician who had worked tirelessly during the COVID pandemic and had been recognized for her community outreach programs. She represented the new generation of Britons, diverse, dedicated, and determined to make a difference. Her presence at the service was part of Charles's deliberate effort to honor those who served others without seeking recognition. The Abbey itself seemed to hold its breath as the appointed time approached. Light streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor where monarchs had been crowned and buried for nearly 1,000 years. The weight of history was palpable, but so was the sense of continuity, life flowing forward, traditions adapting while maintaining their essential meaning. Outside, crowds had gathered despite the cold weather. Many held small candles or wore winter coats decorated with Christmas pins. There were families who had traveled from across the country, tourists who found themselves witnessing an unexpected piece of living history, and London residents who simply wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. Among the crowd was the Patel family from Leicester, parents and 3 children who had driven down early that morning. They weren't particularly religious, but they understood the significance of the moment. For them, the king's leadership of the Advent service represented stability and continuity in uncertain times. Their youngest daughter, 7-year-old Priya, clutched a small British flag and asked endless questions about why the king was so important. The media presence was substantial but respectful. Television crews from around the world had positioned themselves to capture not just the ceremony, but the faces of those attending, the expression of a veteran remembering fallen comrades during a prayer, the smile of a child seeing the pageantry for the first time, the tears of an elderly woman moved by the hymn she had sung since childhood. Inside the abbey, the choir completed their warm-up exercises. The boys' voices soared through the ancient arches during their practice run of O Come, Emmanuel, the traditional Advent hymn that would open the service. Their director, James O'Donnell, felt the familiar thrill of preparing for a moment that would be remembered and recorded for posterity. The organist tested the magnificent organ, its pipes filling the space with rich, complex harmonies that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves. The instrument, with over 6,000 pipes, was itself a piece of history, having provided music for countless royal occasions. Today, it would help create an atmosphere of reverence and celebration that would reach far beyond the abbey walls through television and radio broadcasts. As the time approached, final security checks were completed. The Metropolitan Police had worked for weeks to ensure the safety of all attendees, while maintaining the welcoming atmosphere that the king had specifically requested. Plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd, and snipers took positions on nearby rooftops, but their presence was designed to be invisible to the thousands who had come to participate in or witness the service. Back at the palace, Queen Camilla made her final preparations. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a deep blue coat that would photograph well, but wouldn't overshadow the religious nature of the occasion. Her role today was supportive but significant. She understood that every gesture, every expression would be scrutinized and analyzed. More importantly, she knew how much this service meant to her husband. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had been tested by decades of public scrutiny, but their marriage had grown stronger through shared adversity and mutual support. Today, she would stand beside him not just as queen consort, but as a partner who understood the loneliness of public service and the weight of constant observation. Members of the royal family began arriving at the Abbey in carefully choreographed order. Prince William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, brought their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, each coached on appropriate behavior, but allowed to experience the wonder of the moment. For George, in particular, this was an important lesson in the responsibilities he would one day inherit. Princess Anne arrived with her characteristic efficiency, having reviewed the order of service and timed her entrance perfectly. Known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, she nevertheless understood the deep symbolism of the day and the importance of family unity during public ceremonies. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, Prince Edward and Sophie, represented the quiet dedication that characterized much of the royal family's work. Their presence reminded everyone that monarchy was not just about ceremony, but about consistent, unglamorous service to the public good. As guests continued to arrive, the Abbey filled with a sense of anticipation. Conversations were hushed, but warm, as strangers found common ground in their shared experience. Veterans compared service records, charity workers shared stories of community impact, and young people marveled at finding themselves part of living history. The international dimension of the service was subtly, but clearly present. High commissioners from Commonwealth nations occupied places of honor, representing the global reach of the institution that Charles now headed. Their presence reminded everyone that the king's role extended far beyond Britain's shores to encompass diverse nations and cultures united by historical ties and shared values. Religious leaders from various Christian denominations had been invited to participate, reflecting Charles's long-standing commitment to interfaith dialogue and his role as defender of the faith. The Archbishop of Canterbury would play a central role, but representatives from Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, and Orthodox traditions would also contribute to the service. Rabbi Julia Neuberger represented the Jewish community, Imam Abdullah Patel spoke for British Muslims, and Hindu priest Dr. Shanaka Rishi Das embodied the religious diversity of modern Britain. Their presence wasn't tokenistic, but reflected Charles's genuine belief that the monarchy must serve all Britons regardless of their faith background. The music for the service had been carefully selected to balance tradition with accessibility. While the choir would perform complex classical pieces, the hymns chosen for congregational singing were familiar to most attendees. O come, all ye faithful, and the first Noel would allow everyone to participate fully in the worship experience. Special attention had been paid to making the service accessible to those with disabilities. Sign language interpreters were positioned where they could be seen by deaf attendees, and large print programs had been prepared for those with visual impairments. Wheelchair access had been carefully planned, and assistance was available for anyone who needed it. The children's choir from a local primary school had been invited to participate, their fresh voices representing the future and the continuing relevance of ancient traditions to new generations. Many of these children came from families for whom attending Westminster Abbey would have been unimaginable just a generation ago, reflecting the changing face of Britain. As the final minutes before the king's arrival ticked away, the atmosphere in the Abbey became increasingly charged with expectation. Camera operators made final adjustments, security personnel completed their sweeps, and the congregation settled into reverent silence. The weight of the moment was felt not just by those present, but by millions who would watch the service on television or listen on radio. For many elderly Britons, this would evoke memories of Christmas services attended with parents and grandparents no longer living. For younger viewers, it might represent their first real engagement with traditions that had shaped their country for centuries. The service would be broadcast live to Commonwealth nations, where millions more would participate virtually in this marking of Advent. From Canada to Australia, from Jamaica to South Africa, people would gather around televisions and radios to share in this moment of reflection and hope. As Big Ben began to chime the hour, signaling the king's imminent arrival, a hush fell over Westminster Abbey. History was about to unfold once again in this sacred space, carried forward by a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this role, but was still learning what it meant to be king. The great doors of the Abbey remained closed, but everyone inside could sense the approaching moment when Charles III would enter to lead his people in marking the beginning of Advent, a season of waiting, hoping, and preparing for the light that conquers darkness. The ancient stones seemed to hold their breath, ready to witness another chapter in the ongoing story of faith, tradition, and the enduring power of hope in uncertain times. The sound of the royal procession could be heard approaching Westminster Abbey as the king's car rounded the final corner. Inside the ancient building, 2,000 people rose as one, creating a rustling wave of movement that seemed to ripple through centuries of history. The great doors swung open, and a shaft of winter sunlight illuminated the entrance like a natural spotlight waiting for its star. King Charles III stepped from his car with a measured dignity that had become his trademark since ascending the throne. He paused for just a moment at the threshold of Westminster Abbey, a gesture so brief that most observers missed it, but those who noticed understood its significance. This was a man acknowledging the weight of the moment, the responsibility of leadership, and the sacred nature of the space he was about to enter. Dressed in the deep ceremonial robes of his office, Charles walked slowly down the aisle that had witnessed the footsteps of monarchs for nearly a millennium. His pace was deliberate, allowing those present to truly see their king, not just as a figure of state, but as a human being carrying the hopes and prayers of millions. Queen Camilla followed at his side, her presence both supportive and dignified. She had grown into her role as queen consort with grace that surprised even her critics. The woman who had once been vilified by the tabloid press now commanded respect through her dedication to charitable causes and her unwavering support of her husband during his most challenging period. As the royal couple progressed toward the altar, the faces in the congregation told stories of their own. Margaret Thompson, the elderly volunteer from Birmingham, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the king pass just feet away from her pew. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined being so close to royalty, and the reality exceeded any fantasy she might have entertained. Dr. Amara Okafor, the young physician, felt a surge of pride as she witnessed this moment of national unity. Her own journey from an immigrant family to becoming a respected medical professional seemed to embody the changing face of Britain that Charles was determined to represent and serve. The Patel family, watching from their positions among the crowd outside, pressed against the barriers as the king's arrival was announced through speakers. 7-year-old Priya bounced on her toes, trying to catch a glimpse of what she had been told was a real-life king. Her excitement was infectious, spreading to the adults around her who found themselves smiling despite the cold weather. Inside the abbey, the choir began the opening hymn, O come, Emmanuel, their voices rising like incense toward the vaulted ceiling. The ancient words carried new meaning in the context of Charles's reign, a prayer for wisdom, for guidance, for the strength to lead during uncertain times. The king's voice joined the congregational singing, his deep tones blending with those around him. This was democracy in action, the sovereign and his subjects united in worship, their voices equal before God regardless of their earthly status. It was a moment that perfectly captured Charles's vision of modern monarchy, accessible, inclusive, and deeply rooted in service rather than privilege. Dean David Hoyle stepped forward to welcome the congregation, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge both the religious significance of Advent and the civic importance of the occasion. He spoke of waiting and preparation, of hope sustained through difficult times, and of the light that shines in darkness. His words resonated with particular power in a world still recovering from pandemic disruption and economic uncertainty. The first reading came from the book of Isaiah, delivered by a young woman from Wales whose community had been devastated by recent flooding. Her presence at the lectern represented Charles's commitment to highlighting the voices of those affected by climate change, a cause that had been close to his heart for decades before it became fashionable. As she read the ancient prophecy of peace and restoration, her words carried extra weight. She spoke of valleys being lifted up and mountains made low, of rough places being made smooth and crooked paths being made straight. For those who had lost homes to flooding or businesses to economic hardship, these weren't just biblical metaphors, but promises of hope for their own situations. The children's choir from the local primary school performed next, their clear, innocent voices filling the abbey with once in Royal David City. Many of these children came from families who spoke English as a second language, yet their pronunciation was perfect, their commitment absolute. They represented the future of Britain, diverse, talented, and fully British regardless of their parents' origins. Watching from the royal pew, Prince George listened intently to children not much older than himself. This was part of his education in kingship, understanding that the crown was not about superiority, but about service to all people, regardless of their background or circumstances. Princess Charlotte swayed slightly to the music, her natural grace already evident at her young age. She had begun to understand that her family was different, but these public occasions helped her see that difference as responsibility rather than privilege. Prince Louis, the youngest, struggled to sit still, but was clearly captivated by the pageantry around him. His parents, William and Catherine, took turns gently redirecting his attention while allowing him to experience the wonder of the moment. The sermon was delivered by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had worked closely with Charles for years and understood both his spiritual journey and his vision for the monarchy. He spoke of Advent as a time of preparation, but also of transformation of individuals and communities becoming the best versions of themselves. His words touched on themes that had defined Charles's life: environmental stewardship, interfaith dialogue, and social justice. He reminded the congregation that waiting for the coming of Christ was not passive, but active, requiring believers to work toward the kingdom of heaven on earth. The international guests listened through translation devices, but many understood the English well enough to appreciate the subtle references to global challenges. Climate change, refugee crises, and economic inequality were woven into the sermon not as political talking points, but as spiritual challenges requiring both prayer and action. Representatives from Commonwealth nations found particular meaning in the Archbishop's emphasis on unity and diversity. The British monarchy they were honoring had evolved far beyond its colonial origins to become a voluntary association of independent nations choosing to maintain historical ties while forging their own futures. The highlight of the service came when King Charles himself rose to address the congregation. He had spent weeks crafting his remarks, wanting to strike the right balance between formality and warmth, between tradition and relevance. His speech would be broadcast around the world and analyzed by historians for generations to come. He began by acknowledging the privilege of leading the service, but quickly pivoted to speak of privilege as responsibility. He talked about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how her example had taught him that true leadership meant putting service before self, duty before desire. His voice carried emotion as he spoke of the challenges facing not just Britain, but the world: climate change, inequality, division, and the erosion of trust in institutions. But he also spoke of hope, of the countless individuals he had met who were working tirelessly to make their communities better places. He mentioned Margaret Thompson by name, telling her story of 50 years of volunteer service and drawing applause from the congregation. He spoke of Dr. Okafor and her dedication during the pandemic, of teachers and social workers and firefighters who embodied the spirit of service that Advent called believers to embrace. The king's words about young people were particularly moving. He spoke of children like those in the choir, growing up in an uncertain world, but approaching the future with courage and creativity. He promised that his reign would prioritize their needs, ensuring they inherited a planet and a society better than the one his generation had received. Religious leaders from various faiths listened with appreciation as Charles spoke of the importance of interfaith dialogue and cooperation. His words about different traditions sharing common values of compassion, justice, and service resonated deeply with those who had worked to build bridges between communities. The international dimension of his remarks was carefully calibrated to honor the Commonwealth's diversity while maintaining unity. He spoke of shared history honestly, acknowledging past wrongs while emphasizing shared values and common aspirations for the future. As the king concluded his address, the silence in Westminster Abbey was profound. Even the children seemed to sense that they had witnessed something significant. His words had been neither political nor partisan, but they carried weight because they came from someone who had dedicated his life to understanding the complexities of leadership and the requirements of service. The prayers that followed included petitions for world leaders, for those suffering from war and persecution, for the environment, and for all who work to build more just and peaceful societies. Each prayer was offered by a different voice: a veteran, a teacher, a healthcare worker, a young activist, representing the diversity of modern Britain. The congregation prayed together using words that had been spoken in that space for centuries. Yet the voices speaking them represented a demographic revolution that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of worshipers. This was Britain in the 21st century, multicultural, multi-faith, but united by shared values and common hopes. The offering collected during the service would go to charities working with homeless individuals, reflecting Charles's long-standing commitment to addressing homelessness in Britain. Representatives from these organizations were present, including several people who had themselves experienced homelessness but had been helped back to stability. As the service moved toward its conclusion, the choir prepared for the final hymn. "O come, "All ye faithful," would invite everyone to participate fully, their voices joining in a celebration of faith and hope that transcended denominational boundaries and cultural differences. The organ swelled, filling Westminster Abbey with music that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves. The congregation rose, hymnals in hand, ready to conclude this marking of Advent with a declaration of faith that had sustained believers through centuries of triumph and trial. Outside, the crowd waited patiently for the royal party to emerge, their breath visible in the cold air, but their spirits warmed by the knowledge that they were participating, however distantly, in a moment of national significance. The service had been broadcast live, but being present, being part of the crowd, added a dimension that no television coverage could capture. As the final notes of the hymn echoed through the abbey, King Charles III prepared to process back down the aisle he had walked as heir for so many decades, but now traversed as sovereign. The weight of the crown might be symbolic, but the weight of responsibility it represented was entirely real. The service had been a success by any measure, dignified, inclusive, spiritually meaningful, and nationally unifying. But for Charles, its true value would be measured not in media coverage or public approval ratings, but in whether it had genuinely prepared those present to embrace the spirit of Advent in their daily lives. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey had witnessed another chapter in the continuing story of faith and tradition, adaptation, and continuity. As the king and queen prepared to leave, the building itself seemed to settle back into its patient vigil, ready to host the next generation of worshipers, the next chapter of national life, the next moment when the eternal intersected with the temporal in this sacred space. The final blessing echoed through Westminster Abbey as Dean David Hoyle raised his hands over the assembled congregation. 2,000 people stood in reverent silence, their faces illuminated by the soft light filtering through ancient stained glass windows. King Charles III bowed his head with the rest of the congregation, a gesture that spoke volumes about his understanding of his role, not as supreme authority, but as servant leader. As the blessing concluded, the organ began the recessional voluntary, a triumphant piece that seemed to lift spirits and send hearts soaring. The king and Queen Camilla turned to begin their procession back down the aisle, but their pace was even more measured than their entrance, allowing them to make eye contact with more members of the congregation. Margaret Thompson felt her breath catch as the king paused near her row, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. In that brief instant, she saw not the distant figure from newspaper photographs, but a man who carried the weight of his office with genuine humility. Later, she would tell her family that she felt seen, truly seen, by her monarch in a way that validated her lifetime of quiet service. Dr. Amara Okafor noticed how Queen Camilla's smile reached her eyes as she passed, particularly when she saw the children in the congregation. The Queen Consort had developed a special connection with young people through her literacy programs, and her genuine affection for them was evident in every gesture. As the royal couple progressed toward the abbey doors, the choir continued to sing, their voices following the procession like an invisible escort of angels. The boys' soprano voices soared above the lower harmonies, creating a sound that seemed to transcend the physical boundaries of the building and reach towards something eternal. Prince William and Catherine gathered their children efficiently, but gently. Prince George had remained remarkably composed throughout the service, his developing understanding of duty evident in his careful attention to protocol. Princess Charlotte whispered something to her mother about the beautiful music, while Prince Louis had finally succumbed to the warmth and comfort of the abbey and dozed against his father's shoulder. The extended royal family followed in carefully choreographed order, each member understanding their role in the larger pageant while maintaining their individual dignity. Princess Anne moved with her characteristic brisk efficiency, while the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh managed the delicate balance of formality and warmth that had become their trademark. International representatives rose as the royal party passed, many feeling the weight of the moment in different ways. For some, This represented the continuation of traditions that connected their nations to Britain across centuries of shared history. For others, it was an opportunity to witness how ancient institutions could adapt and remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. As King Charles reached the great doors of Westminster Abbey, he paused once more, turning to face the congregation that remained standing in respectful attention. His slight bow was a gesture of gratitude that would be remembered by everyone present, a moment when the sovereign acknowledged not just his subjects, but his partners in the great work of building a better society. The doors opened to reveal a gray December afternoon, but the crowd waiting outside erupted in cheers that seemed to chase away the winter chill. The Patel family pressed forward against the barriers, young Priya finally, getting her glimpse of the real-life king she had been hoping to see. Her excited squeals of delight were heard by many around her, including some hardened journalists who found themselves smiling despite their professional detachment. Television cameras captured every moment as the king and queen emerged from Westminster Abbey, but they also caught something else: the genuine warmth of the crowd's response and the obvious pleasure it gave the royal couple. This was not the dutiful applause of a commanded audience, but the spontaneous appreciation of people who felt genuinely represented and served. Security personnel maintained their vigilance while allowing the atmosphere to remain welcoming and accessible. The Metropolitan Police had worked for weeks to perfect the balance between safety and openness, understanding that the king's vision of modern monarchy required genuine connection with the people rather than isolation from them. Local businesses had prepared for the influx of visitors, and street vendors offered hot chocolate and roasted chestnuts to those who had stood in the cold for hours. The commercial activity added to rather than detracted from the dignity of the occasion, reminding everyone that this was a living, working city where sacred and secular coexisted naturally. Media representatives from around the world filed their reports, many focusing on the seamless blend of tradition and modernity that had characterized the service. International observers noted particularly the diversity of the congregation and the king's obvious comfort with religious and cultural pluralism. Commonwealth journalists paid special attention to the king's references to shared values and common challenges, understanding that his words would be analyzed carefully in capitals from Ottawa to Canberra. The delicate balance between honoring historical connections and respecting contemporary sovereignty had been maintained with skill that reflected years of diplomatic experience. Inside Westminster Abbey, the cleanup began immediately, but the atmosphere remained charged with the energy of the completed service. Flower arrangements would be distributed to local hospitals and care homes, extending the beauty and symbolism of the day to those who could not attend. Programs would be collected and archived, becoming historical documents for future researchers studying the evolution of the monarchy. The children's choir from the local primary school gathered their belongings with excitement still bubbling over from their performance. Their teacher, Mrs. Sarah Williams, felt tears of pride as she watched her students process what they had just accomplished. Many of these children had never sung in public before, let alone in Westminster Abbey before the King of England. 8-year-old Hassan Ali, whose family had moved to London from Somalia 5 years earlier, clutched his choir folder tightly as he told his friends about seeing the king up close. His perfect English pronunciation of the traditional hymns represented everything that was hopeful about integration and belonging in modern Britain. The adult choir members began the careful process of storing their music and hanging up their robes, but their conversation buzzed with appreciation for the acoustic perfection they had achieved. Westminster Abbey was renowned among musicians for its challenging acoustics, but today everything had come together flawlessly. James O'Donnell, the choir director, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he reviewed the service in his mind. The balance between ancient traditions and contemporary relevance had been exactly what the occasion demanded. The music had enhanced rather than overwhelmed the spiritual message, supporting the liturgy while allowing individual voices to shine. The organist completed his shutdown procedures for the magnificent instrument, each stop carefully returned to its resting position. The organ had performed beautifully, its thousands of pipes creating the sonic foundation that had supported every prayer, every hymn, every moment of reflection throughout the service. Back at Buckingham Palace, preparations were already underway for the reception that would follow the service. Carefully selected guests would have the opportunity to meet the King and Queen Camilla informally, continuing the conversation that the service had begun about service, community, and shared responsibility. Margaret Thompson found herself among those invited, still hardly believing that her decades of volunteer work had been recognized at such a level. She had changed from her best coat into an even better dress, save for the most special occasions, and practiced what she might say if given the chance to speak with the king personally. Dr. Amara Okafor checked her watch, calculating how much time she could spend at the reception before returning to her hospital duties. The invitation had been an unexpected honor, but her commitment to her patients remained paramount. She hoped to speak with other healthcare workers who might be present, building networks that could benefit community health initiatives. The palace staff had worked for days to ensure that the reception would reflect the king's values of inclusivity and accessibility. The guest list included not just the prominent figures who typically attended royal events, but also the community workers, volunteers, and public servants whose contributions were often overlooked by traditional society functions. Catering arrangements emphasized British produce and sustainable practices, reflecting both the king's environmental commitments and his support for local agriculture. The menu had been designed to accommodate various dietary restrictions and cultural preferences, ensuring that all guests could participate fully in hospitality. The reception rooms had been decorated with flowers from the royal gardens, but the arrangements were deliberately understated, allowing the focus to remain on the conversations and connections that the king hoped would develop among his diverse group of guests. This was not meant to be a display of royal wealth, but a celebration of British values and community spirit. As the first guests began arriving at the palace, the contrast with the formal grandeur of Westminster Abbey was striking, but deliberate. The reception aimed to extend the spirit of the Advent service into more intimate conversations about how its message could be lived out in daily life. King Charles had changed from his ceremonial robes into a more conventional dark suit, but his demeanor remained warm and engaged. He moved through the reception rooms with practiced ease, but his conversation showed genuine interest in each person's work and circumstances. This was not mere royal duty, but authentic curiosity about the lives of his subjects. Queen Camilla proved equally skilled at putting guests at ease, her years of experience in public life having taught her how to ask questions that drew people out and made them feel valued. Her particular interest in literacy and education created natural conversation starters with teachers and librarians among the guests. The atmosphere in the reception rooms was unlike typical royal events. Conversations were animated and substantive, with guests sharing stories of their work and communities rather than simply enjoying the privilege of royal proximity. The king's intention to use such occasions for learning and connection was clearly being fulfilled. Religious leaders from various traditions found themselves in deep discussion about interfaith cooperation and community building. The Advent service had provided a Christian framework, but the reception allowed for broader conversations about shared values and common goals across different faith communities. Young people present brought energy and fresh perspectives to discussions about climate change, social media's impact on community, and the changing nature of civic engagement. The king listened carefully to their insights, understanding that his reign's success would ultimately be measured by how well it served future generations. International guests appreciated the opportunity to engage in more informal diplomacy, discussing how the themes raised in the service might translate into practical cooperation between their nations and Britain. The soft power of such cultural and religious exchanges often proved more effective than formal diplomatic negotiations. As the afternoon progressed, the reception achieved exactly what the king had hoped. Meaningful connections between people who might not otherwise meet, conversations that might lead to collaborations, and a sense of shared purpose that extended far beyond the walls of the palace. The success of both the service and reception would be measured not in media coverage or social media metrics, but in the actions taken by attendees in the days and weeks that followed. Had the experience inspired greater community involvement? Had new partnerships been formed? Had the message of Advent, preparation, hope, and service been translated into practical commitment? As guests began to depart, many exchanged contact information and made tentative plans for future meetings. The king's vision of the monarchy as a catalyst for positive social change was being realized through these individual connections and commitments. The day had begun with ancient traditions in one of England's most historic buildings, but it was ending with contemporary conversations about modern challenges and opportunities. The thread connecting both experiences was the understanding that true leadership, whether royal or civic, was ultimately about service to others and commitment to the common good.